These lectures are titled Great Authors of the Western Literary Tradition, Part 4, Literature of the Renaissance. The lecturer is Professor Ronald B. Hertzman. Dr. Hertzman is Distinguished Teaching Professor of English at the State University of New York at Geneseo, where he has taught since 1969. He graduated with honors from Manhattan College and received his master's and PhD in English literature from the University of Delaware. Dr. Hertzman's teaching interests include Dante, Chaucer, Francis of Assisi, Shakespeare, the Bible, and Arthurian literature. He has written many articles and book chapters and is the co-author of the books The Apocalyptic Imagination in Medieval Literature and The Medieval Worldview. Professor Hertzman received the Chancellor's Award for Excellence in Teaching in 1976, and in 1991, Manhattan College awarded him the honorary degree Doctor of Humane Letters. In 2003, he was awarded the first ever Cara Award for Excellence in Teaching Medieval Studies from the Medieval Academy of America. In 2004, he was elected to Phi Beta Kappa as a foundation member of the Geneseo chapter. Professor Hertzman prepared the course guide that comes with these lectures. The course guide includes a detailed outline of each lecture, a glossary, a timeline, biographical notes, and an annotated bibliography. To get the most out of this course, you may find it useful to follow along with the outlines or review them before or after each lecture. Lecture 37, Christine de Pizan.
In this first lecture on the literature of the Renaissance, we'll be looking at the interesting figure of Christine de Pizan. She is herself, I think, a good person to begin these lectures with because she is a transitional figure looking back to the great medieval predecessors like Dante, whom she draws from, and also looking forward to the concerns of the other writers that we'll be dealing with, concerns often grouped under the umbrella term humanism, which is, of course, not to say that she wasn't an extremely interesting person in her own right, both in her life and in her works. She was born in 1365. Her father comes from Pisa to serve as court scientist for the King of France. De Pizan means Christine from Pisa, and one of the results of that was that Christine herself got a very good education. She was married at the age of 15, not as unusual in her time as in ours, and she was widowed at the age of 26 with 3 children. She turned to writing as a way to support herself, and one of the things that makes her such an interesting figure in the history of literature is that she is thought to be the first woman to make a career out of writing, to actually use it as the way to put bread on the table. She was a popular and an influential writer in her own day, and she is popular and I think even influential in ours, though the intervening centuries have not necessarily been quite so kind to her. She wrote on a wide variety of topics. She wrote, for example, a Life of Joan of Arc. She entered into some of the important debates of the time, including a debate over the important medieval text, The Romance of the Rose. She wrote an addition to an important book on warfare. She translated it and did some additions of her own. And she wrote a conduct manual for ladies. The work that we're going to concentrate on, I think it could be argued it's her major work, but it's certainly the one that has the most, I think, to say to present audiences, is a work called The Book of the City of Ladies. In a nutshell, the Book of the City of Ladies is an allegory in which Christine attacks the anti-feminism of her own culture. It's made up of stories of virtuous women, and the point Christine makes over and over again is that women can have virtues just like men. This may seem to be a fairly obvious point, but what Christine says in the book is that women have, in fact, historically and in the present, that is to say, her present, been put down in many different ways. There are actually books out there that say that women don't have, are not capable of having virtues, or at least not to the same degree as men. And there's also an expectation that women are not really going to be as good as men. What Christine says is, look, it's very simple. Women haven't been as good as men in many areas because they haven't had an equal opportunity in many areas. The Book of the City of Ladies is an impressive and moving plea for equal opportunity, and as such has a good deal to say to us today. She presents all of this in an allegorical framework, and that framework really consists of building a city, constructing a city, out of virtues which she thinks that women no less than men can achieve. Well, the idea of constructing a city out of virtues is an idea that in fact can be traced all the way back to Plato. In the Republic, Plato says that a good city is going to consist of the following virtues. It's going to be wise. It's going to consist of the virtues of wisdom, of courage, of moderation, and of justice. Christine comes along and sort of runs with this idea, but actually takes it a bit further by relating the virtues to the actual physical construction of a city. So she constructs a city of virtues in which Lady Reason comes to build the foundations, Lady Rectitude comes to put up the walls and the buildings, and finally Lady Justice is going to crown the city with its roofs and to decorate the city. What happens is that these personifications, Lady Reason, Lady Rectitude, Lady Justice, come to the narrator, Christine, and educate her by telling her stories about women who have achieved virtue. She follows Dante. Dante, in the construction of his afterlife, doesn't really make a distinction between people who are real and people who are fictional. That is to say, they occupy the same plane of reality, so that we will see somebody like Ulysses along with somebody like Charlemagne together on the same plane of existence. She does this also. She tells stories, in other words, about people we can learn about from history, but also people that we can learn about by reading other texts. And what's kind of interesting is the texts that she goes to in order to extract these examples of virtue. She follows Dante in this way also, in that she weaves classical and biblical figures together along with examples from history, even moving up to her own time. The structure is something like this. Christine, the narrator, is sitting in her study, not only lamenting all of the bad things that have been said about women, but also internalizing them. That is to say, she has, in the fiction of the story here, come to believe all of the bad things that folks have been saying about women. So she says, I really had to come to terms with the fact that when God created women, he created a vile creature indeed. Well, the three personifications come to talk her out of that position, and they are the ones who present her with the opportunity to learn, to take her out of her dark wood of error. In other words, in this way, too, she's following Dante, I think, in a very deliberate, self-conscious way, as Dante has three guides to the afterlife who lead him from ignorance to knowledge. Christine's dark wood is believing all of those negative stereotypes about women that have been part of the tradition that she has grown up in and, of course, have been part of contemporary society. Well, what she does is listen to these tales and learn from them, but of course Christine, the author, is really constructing the tales in such a way that they will emphasize all of the different ways in which women have been representative of virtue. Christine gives, for example, what can only be called a feminist reading of a great many of the stories from the Bible. And what I'd like to do is to show how she uses one biblical story and one story from the classical tradition and sort of put those two things together as our best intro into what's actually going on in the text of the Book of the City of Ladies. There's this story in the Gospel of St. Matthew where a Canaanite woman comes to Jesus and says, "Cure my daughter." It's the story about a woman who would not take no for an answer. She says, "My daughter is possessed by a demon." Jesus puts her off saying, "I was only sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." Well, the woman doesn't give up. She keeps on coming. And finally, Jesus answers her by saying, "Okay, woman, great is your faith. Be it done for you as you desire. Your daughter is cured." It's almost as though Jesus has been worn down by this woman's insistence. Well, Christine looks at this story and says, let's talk about it from a feminist perspective. Let's see what this means. She makes some fairly obvious points and some subtle ones in her exegesis of this gospel narrative. First of all, she says, look, it's the woman's talkativeness which is a sign of her inner faith. So she takes a stereotypical womanly quality, a quality that has been sort of ridiculed from comedy all the way from Aristophanes up to I Love Lucy, and she says this is really something seen in this context, which is positive rather than negative. Second, she points out that this story illustrates that Jesus clearly did not ignore women, and then pointedly compares that to the present, that is to say, to her own lifetime. She says, how often will our contemporary popes deign to discuss anything with a simple little woman, let alone stories of their own salvation? If we go back to the story for a minute, the message that's, I think, apparent in any thorough exegesis of the passage is that Jesus is something more than simply a Jewish Messiah. He is also a Messiah to the Gentiles. That is to say, his message is much larger, for a much larger audience than perhaps even he realized. Well, it seems to me that Christine is subtly piggybacking onto this notion and suggesting that just as the Gentiles, who they are, sort of has expanded as Christianity itself expands, so that, for example, St. Paul talks about a mission to the Gentiles. By the time St. Augustine comes along, he means that to include incorporating large elements of classical culture and classical learning into Christianity. For Christine, what she wants to suggest is that those who need to be more thoroughly, more appropriately, more fully brought into the Christian community are women. That is to say, women need to be given the same kind of rights and privileges within Christianity that men have. Now, it's also important when we look at this story to realize what Christine is doing. She is not in any way changing the biblical story. She's simply making a couple points about it that are very important for her larger purposes. One is, implicitly, that the exegesis of this story has in the past been in the control of men. They're the ones who have told us what the story means. What would happen if women were to look at the same story? They would come out with things that not necessarily are opposed to a masculine, traditional reading of the story, but could add something to it, so that she is consistently respectful of the Bible and doesn't believe in any way that's her job to change the biblical stories. She's simply saying, let's take a look at them from a perspective that has been overlooked, and of course from her point of view, sadly overlooked in the past. So that what she does in one part of the book is to deal with the Christian tradition gently and firmly at the same time, essentially challenging it to live up to its own best understanding of itself. Christine also gives a reading of many classical stories. And here, I think it's interesting to see that what she does is not so much reinterpret the classical stories and the classical tradition, but rather what she does is rewrite them, truly revise them. One of the most interesting is the story of Dido and Aeneas, famously told in Book 4 of Virgil's Aeneid. In Virgil, it turns out to be not only one of the red-hot love stories of the ancient world, but also a test case for the proper relationship between duty and desire, a theme that runs through the heart of the Aeneid. Aeneas is washed up on shore in Carthage. Dido, queen of Carthage, comes to the rescue, basically gives him a place to stay, a place to refresh, and then gives him her love. And so they carry on this red-hot romance until the time that Aeneas leaves Dido, because his duty to go ahead and found Rome, is much more important than his happiness. Well, when Christine tells this story in the book of the City of Ladies, she changes it in several very significant ways. And I think those ways are worth talking about. One thing that she does is to spend a lot more time talking about the history of Dido herself before she hooks up with Aeneas. It turns out that all of the things that one learns about Aeneas are paralleled in this revisionist telling of the story by Christine. Aeneas is in exile from Troy. Dido is in exile from Phoenicia. Aeneas has to go and found a new city. That's his destiny. Dido has already done so. She's at Carthage, successfully ruling this city on the coast of Africa because of her skill and intelligence as a leader, something, of course, which is meant to compare with the leadership qualities of Aeneas himself. And more than that, she is seen as somebody who has overcome a huge number of horrific incidents in her previous life. The reason that she is on the lam in the first place, the reason that she has to leave Phoenicia, is because her husband has been cruelly murdered, and the murderer is now after her. Well, Christine tells the story and says, by the way, when this happened, she almost died of grief. She loved her husband so much that what she was able to do was barely move, but all of a sudden she realized not simply that life goes on, but she had an obligation to others, and so she continues on her way, and out of the ashes of that tragedy, she builds a new life. I think that there are a couple of things that are worth talking about here, not simply the fact that it's a parallel to Virgil, but that notion of almost dying for grief, not knowing whether or not she's going to be able to go on, seems to me to be a thinly veiled biographical detail in which Christine might well be relating to us something about her own life on the death of her husband, and that there's a kind of parallel to be drawn between Dido building an empire and Christine building an empire of words, if you will, by becoming a writer. In any case, there are all kinds of other interesting parallels as well. In Christine, what we see is that Dido uses this as an opportunity and is doing really, really fine until the time that Aeneas comes along. Now, in Christine's version, the reason that Aeneas leaves Dido is because he's treacherous and is not really capable of the same kind of love that she is. And I think that that's a sort of important thing to take a quick look at. Dido and Aeneas, she tells us, spent so much time with one another that love, who knows how to subjugate all hearts with the greatest of skill, made them become enamored of one another. But as experience showed, Dido's love for Aeneas was far greater than his love for her, for even though he had given her his pledge never to take any other woman to be hers forever, he left, after she had restored and enriched him, with property and ease, his ships refreshed, repaired, and placed in order, filled with treasure and wealth, like a woman who had spared no expense where her heart was involved. Well, this is a very interesting passage because it suggests, among other things, a very different conception of love than the conception that we see in Virgil. For Virgil, love is red-hot passion. It is a flame. It is destructive. And for Virgil, it's pretty clear that ultimately that kind of love and duty are simply not compatible with each other. Christine suggests that it's a different kind of tragedy here because she's suggesting that love is more about tenderness and romance. And this suggests, I think, a shift both in the masculine perspective of the Aeneid and also in changing conceptions of love itself. That romantic love has really entered into literary consciousness in a way that was not really there in the ancient world. But it's also interesting to see that it means that she has to change the story to a very great extent in order to do this. Because if you take a look at the account that is given to us in the Aeneid, there's nothing at all that talks about treachery on the part of Aeneas. He tries to explain things to her, although rather unsuccessfully. But the real deal is that he simply has to make a choice. It's a choice between love and duty. And indeed, Virgil makes it clear that for Aeneas, this was a fling, not a marriage. Which is to say, when they're having their kind of can we still be friends chat in Book 4 of the Aeneid, Aeneas says, but I never really took marriage vows. This doesn't do anything to make Dido happy, but what it does do is sort of point out the fact that it was a fling from beginning to end from his point of view, whatever else Dido might have thought of it. One of the things that we're told is that Dido calls it a marriage, and by that, Virgil tells us, she covers up her fault. Well, in Christine, it is a marriage. And so the treachery is particularly strong on the part of Aeneas in his version because, of course, what he is doing is leaving his wife. Now, it's interesting to see there, too, the way that she manages to pull the story to an end. What happens in Virgil is that Dido goes absolutely berserk, kills herself, and that suicide sort of signals the enmity that's going to exist down through history between Carthage and Rome. Well, it's Virgil's answer to why Rome is going to have to fight these great battles with Carthage later on. It's also Virgil's answer to the question of why Rome wins later on. Aeneas represents reason, Dido represents unbridled passion, reason wins out over passion, Rome beats up on Carthage. So it's a way of talking about Roman history, even as that history is embedded in this red-hot love affair. Christine, however, I think is doing something a little bit more subtle in terms of the way that she's positioning Dido here. Because, of course, remember previously what happened in the first part of Dido's life. She is scarcely able to continue after her first husband dies. Well, what's going to happen now that she has lost her second? This means that it's really more than anybody could rightfully be thought to bear. And so what's kind of interesting is that it becomes, if not a justification, at least a mitigation for the suicide of Dido at the end. The suicide would never have happened if this guy hadn't come along. it wouldn't have happened if she hadn't been so generous. One of the things that's problematic is that women are generous and that generosity sometimes goes very much unrewarded. And so what we see is that suicide becomes a way of talking about all of the ways in which men really don't do their duty to what they owe to women. Now, if we step back from this for a minute and say, well, okay, what are we going to do with this? One of the first things that we have to come to terms with is that Christine has allowed herself or taken the right, duty, and privilege of revising in a fairly serious and significant way a canonical story from the ancient world. Probably no story or no poem was better known in Christine's time than Virgil's Aeneid. It's not as though she's trying to slip one by so that folks really won't know that her version changes things. She knows this and in all probability expects that her reader will know it as well. So one question that inevitably comes up is what gives her the right to manipulate the story in this way? Notice that she was much more cautious and careful in her use of the biblical material. She didn't change a word of the story. All she did was look at it and say, let's see how this can be interpreted in a way that's different from the way in which it has been interpreted traditionally, in the way it's been interpreted when males are doing all of the interpreting. But here, she downright takes the story and changes it in some of its most significant points. Well, I think it's important to sort of backtrack and realize that she's not the first to do this. She's actually placing herself in a fairly exalted tradition, because Virgil himself constructs his epic poem, his great Latin epic, the Aeneid, by revising in very significant ways the Greek epics of Homer. One could look at the Aeneid and see it as a rewriting of the Iliad and the Odyssey told from the point of view of the losers, that is to say, from the point of view of the Trojans. And what Virgil is doing is saying, thereby, what I'm doing is suggesting that now, since these Trojans are the ancestors of Rome, that now, in a sense, skill in epic has passed from Greece to Rome. So my revision is also my saying that I'm going to somehow go beyond my predecessor. Well, it's also interesting to see that another person who comes along and revises and rewrites in this way is the person that we've already suggested is a model for Christine, and that is Dante. It might be pointed out, I think, at this point, that in fact, not only did Christine know her Dante quite well, but she is credited with bringing a knowledge of Dante from Italy to France, that France got to know the writings of Dante through the intermediary of Christine de Pizan. Well, in any case, what you see is that she is sort of saying what they did, what these guys did, what the greatest poets in history did, is what I'm going to do. If it was good enough for Dante, for Virgil, it's good enough for me. And so she shows both that she wants to play there in the same arena as the big guys, and that somehow she has the right to do this, that the work itself justifies what she's trying to do. And I think that we can relate this to her entire agenda. We mentioned earlier that one of the things that marks Christine is this strong sense of give us the right opportunity and we'll be able to do just as well as men. Significantly enough, she mentions this in terms of a field where, certainly in Christine's time, women were not supposed to be very good or maybe even play at all. In the field of science, she looks around and she says, how come it's the case that there aren't really many good women scientists? She uses that as her test case to say, give us the same opportunity and we would be able to perform just as well. Well, what I'm trying to suggest here, I guess, is that Christine is sort of flipping that around a little bit and saying, what happens if you have been given the same opportunity? In Christine's own case, what this means is that she has been given the opportunity of a first-rate education, a knowledge of all of her literary predecessors, and so I think what she's saying is, because I have this opportunity, then it's not simply my right to change these texts, to redo them, to update them for the present, but in a sense it's a kind of duty that I have, a kind of obligation. Because if what I'm saying makes any sense, then it means that women are going to be able to play with the guys, and so let me try and make this as a kind of offer to show that this is the case. There's also another way in which Christine anticipates some of the other writers that we're going to see in this regard, because what Christine is also doing is suggesting that there's a new language that is appropriate for her to do this. Virgil wrote his poem in Latin, of course. Dante wrote his in Italian. It's interesting to point out that Christine writes the Book of the City of Ladies in French. There are two reasons for this. First, let's remind ourselves once again, Christine was making her living as a writer. French would be the more appropriate language precisely because there are more readers of French than of Latin. And this would be especially true for her women audience. There were many literate women who were not literate in Latin. The second reason is that Christine is trying to establish a kind of cultural moment for French literature so that it becomes worthy to take its place with Greek, with Latin, with Italian, and now French as a worthy vehicle for artistic achievement.